choice that will define the future of a region that served as the cradle of civilization and a crucible of strife.
We begin our headlines tonight in Egypt, Israel, Jerusalem, Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Gulf states. A lion that was rescued from the abandoned zoo in Syria has given birth to a cub just hours after.
In the pursuit of a broader peace and peace with the Palestinians. And I greatly look forward to discussing this in detail with you, Mr. President.
Hi, my name is Gemma Neary and welcome to this week's edition of the Modern Middle East. Throughout the show we'll look at the region's tourism industries. We'll be joined by an archaeologist with extensive field experience in Egypt and Syria, and we'll finish with a feature travel story about a Canadian couple who sailed the Nile in Egypt. But first, let's look at what's been happening in the Middle East. We begin our headlines at the Iran-Iraq border tonight, where a 5.9 magnitude earthquake has left 2 people dead and 241 injured. The epicenter of the quake was in western Iran, where the state's Emergency and Natural Disaster Agency deployed 5 rescue teams. But the tremor was felt as far as Iraq's capital, Baghdad, over 242 kilometers away. The region is prone to severe earthquakes, such as last November when a 7.3 magnitude quake killed over 400 people and injured thousands. A number of violent clashes broke out between Israeli authorities and Palestinian protesters in Gaza and the West Bank. At the Israel-Gaza border, 180 Palestinians were injured, a third from live gunfire by the Israeli Defense Force, during a weekly protest demonstrating the desire of Palestinians to return to their original homeland. While in the West Bank, dozens of Palestinians were injured during a protest against the Israeli government's seizure of Palestinian land for the development of Jewish settlements. An investigative report released by the United Nations concluded that the actions of warring parties in the ongoing conflict in Yemen could amount to war crimes. Findings revealed that over the last 3 years, an estimated 18,000 airstrikes carried out by the Saudi Arabian-led coalition have caused the majority of the war's civilian casualties. The report coincides with the Pentagon's announcement that the United States will scale back their military support of the Saudi coalition if they're unable to demonstrate an effort to reduce harm to civilians. The Syrian government continued to build up forces around the rebel-held city of Idlib, igniting international alarm that a military assault to retake the territory could be days away. In addition to a potential humanitarian crisis, analysts are concerned that if the regime faces strong resistance, they may employ the use of chemical weapons to accelerate their offensive. Idlib is the last major city controlled by opposition forces and home to over 3 million people, half of which have already been displaced from other parts of the country. In a story broken by Reuters news agency, Iran has been reportedly transferring short-range ballistic missiles to allied Shiite groups in Iraq over the last few months. The transfers were confirmed to Reuters by a number of Iranian, Iraqi and Western intelligence sources and have been seen as a strategic move that also highlights Iran's military capability to rivals such as Israel and the United States. A spokesman for Iran's foreign ministry labelled the claims false, ridiculous, and an attempt to undermine the country's foreign relationships. The United States announced it will end its funding to UNRWA, the United Nations body responsible for providing health, educational, and social services to Palestinian refugees. The US was previously the body's largest funding donor, but the State Department recently described the organization as irredeemably flawed and argued other states in the region should shoulder the funding responsibility. UNRWA has strongly rejected the criticism and highlighted their track record of providing vital humanitarian assistance to over 5 million refugees in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Iran took their fight against the United States' reintroduction of sanctions on Tehran to the International Court of Justice. However, a verdict on the trial could potentially take years to reach. Iranian officials challenged the legality of the sanctions regime, arguing they're in breach of a treaty signed in 1955, at a time when the two countries were allied. The United States reimposed sanctions on Iran after withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, a multilateral agreement which the UN's atomic watchdog recently confirmed Iran has continued to adhere to. Lastly, Saudi Arabia is reportedly considering a plan to dig a trench along its shared border with Qatar to force the tiny Gulf state off the Arabian Peninsula, turning it into an island. A senior Saudi advisor hinted at the historic project on Twitter, and if the rumours were true, the move would dramatically escalate the ongoing diplomatic feud between the neighbouring states. However, critics have suggested the statement is just rhetoric to intimidate Qatar, rather than a legitimate construction initiative. Let's move on now to the focus of this week's episode, whether the tourism industries in the Middle East can withstand the region's instability. For 40 years, Khaled al-Assad served as the Director of Antiquities for the ancient Syrian city of Palmyra. Until his retirement in 2003, al-Assad dedicated almost his entire career to protecting the archaeological ruins, enthusiastically promoting research, restoration and tourism. His expertise and love of the UNESCO World Heritage Site even earned him the nickname Mr. Palmyra. In 2015, Islamic State militants that had overrun the city dragged 83-year-old al-Assad into the street after weeks of imprisonment and beheaded him in front of a public crowd. Analysts suspect he may have been executed because he refused to give up the location of valuable Palmyran artifacts, which militants would have destroyed or sold on the black market. The extraordinary history and culture of the Middle East is in constant contention with the instability that plagues the region. Political uprisings, rogue terrorist attacks, and civil wars have collapsed once thriving tourism industries in countries such as Turkey, Egypt, and Syria. Before the Syrian civil war broke out, the country welcomed 8.5 million international tourists in 2010, 3 million more than what Australia recorded the same year. Recent terrorist attacks have haunted residents and shaken tourists in major cities around the world, including Paris, London and Sydney, and are a somber reminder that violence and unpredictability are not exclusive to the Middle East.
Another thing is that European countries have more resources to recover from terrorist attacks compared to Middle East countries which have lower funds to recover the tourism infrastructures.
Tourism is a crucial international industry that promotes peace, cultural preservation and economic growth, accounting for 1 out of 10 jobs worldwide and 10% of the global GDP. Booming tourism industries can directly generate high-income revenue through amenities such as accommodation and attractions, as well as indirectly through government investments such as construction and marketing initiatives. Egypt particularly relies on the revenue generated by the tourism sector, which peaked at 14.1 million international visitors in 2010. However, a number of events in the years since have devastated the industry. Arrivals plummeted to 5 million in 2016, forcing many employees of the accommodation and tour sectors to search for alternative work because the demand is no longer there. The decline in visitors to attractions such as the pyramids has also alerted international body UNESCO, which considers tourism one of the most effective ways to sustain archaeological conservation. Of the 54 locations on UNESCO's World Heritage in Danger list, a third are in the Middle East, including sites in Egypt, Iraq, Palestine, Syria and Yemen. The rise of the Islamic State was a particular threat to the preservation of archaeological ruins in Iraq and Syria, as the group considers relics that predate Islam contradictory to their radical ideology.
Well, it's been a massive threat. I think we're currently living through, or have lived through, perhaps the worst period of heritage destruction in human history.
During ISIL's occupation of Mosul in Iraq, reports emerged in March 2015 that militants had used sledgehammers and bombs to demolish up to 70% of the archaeological site of Nimrud. The 3,000-year-old ruins were a part of the ancient Assyrian Empire, and before the occupation were a cultural attraction that employed local Iraqis and provided international visitors a glimpse into the region's heritage. Similar fears were held for Palmyra in Syria after it was captured by ISIL the following month. The city was a physical crossroads between ancient civilizations and developed in a melting pot of Greek, Roman, Persian and Islamic influences. Before militants were expelled by government forces, they significantly damaged a number of 2,000-year-old sites and used others as a strategic base, carrying out executions in the Roman amphitheatre and using ancient stone walls for shooting practice. While the Middle East continues to struggle with both the aftermath and prospect of instability, the region's tourism industries have begun to show promising signs of recovery. In the first 6 months of 2017, global tourism growth was highest in the Middle East, with a 9% increase in international arrivals. Palestine and Egypt also claimed the first and second spots on the World Tourism Organization's fastest growing destinations list. The tourism industry has proven resilient in the past, and it's expected that as consumer confidence returns in the years to come, the region will continue to bounce back from both the economic and physical damage inflicted by recent events. Because while it must be a magical feeling to walk alone among ancient ruins without bumping up against crowds of tourists, it's unlikely that's what Mr. Palmyra was hoping for. We have to go to a break, but stick around as field archaeologist, Associate Professor Andrew Jamieson joins us in the studio to talk about his experience uncovering ancient sites and artifacts in Egypt and Syria. Welcome back. Joining us in the studio is Associate Professor Andrew Jamieson, an archaeologist with extensive Middle East field experience in Egypt, Syria and Lebanon, Australia's representative on the Shirin International Committee for the Protection of Syrian Heritage, and a senior lecturer in Near Eastern Archaeology at the University of Melbourne. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Gemma, it's great to be here.
Firstly, can you tell us a bit about why you got into your field? What interests you about archaeology?
So, it goes back to the very beginning. I've always had a fascination with old things, archaeology, and particularly the archaeology of the ancient Near East. As a young child, I was given a book, I don't know whether it was for a birthday or for Christmas, on Howard Carter's discoveries of the tomb of Tutankhamun.
Yeah.
And those evocative images, that great archaeological discovery, became an obsession, and it really has been a lifelong interest in ancient history and archaeology, and it developed into studies at university, and I was very, very fortunate. In the first year of my studies at the university, I was invited to go on an archaeological project, believe it or not, to Egypt. And from the first day, I absolutely loved it, fell in love with archaeology, and it determined my destiny. You know, and for the last 35 years, I've been going back and forth to the Middle East and working on projects, as you mentioned, in Egypt, in Syria, and in Lebanon.
Yeah, so much passion, it's fantastic. So you've travelled to the Middle East countless times, as you just mentioned. What were the purposes of your trips to Egypt and Syria?
So as I mentioned, in that very first trip, it was to work on an archaeological project, a project in the Western Desert, one of the 5 oases of the Western Desert, Dakhla, and an amazingly rich archaeological region, and the archaeology there was producing some spectacular discoveries, and that was fabulous. And I went back and forth to Egypt for a number of years, and then in 1988 I was invited to join a new project that was developing in Syria. It was a salvage excavation in the north of Syria on the Euphrates River, and for the next 10 years, from 1988 to 1997, I was involved in those excavations at a site called Tel Akmar, and it was one of a number of sites that were going to be flooded as a result of the construction of a hydroelectric dam on the Euphrates River. And the University of Melbourne was one of many international teams that joined that rescue initiative, and we worked there for over a decade with those excavations.
What kind of sites and artefacts were you working with there? What time period were they from?
Well, in Syria, at the site of Tel Akmar, it was mostly from the Iron Age, from the first millennium. In fact, it was a capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And as soon as we sunk our trowels into the ground, just below the surface, we came down on elite residences from this first millennium Neo-Assyrian period, 7th century BC, and we exposed 3, 4, 5 houses, very well preserved architecture, walls up to a height of 2 metres, and within those buildings were the most spectacular archaeological finds.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Carved Phoenician ivories, cuneiform tablets inscribed with correspondence, cylinder seals, life-size basalt statues, underground tombs. It was an incredible archaeological experience, and some really significant discoveries were made.
Yeah, how lucky you are to have been there. That would have been amazing to see. Is there any particular site other than that one or artefact that you've worked with throughout your career that stands out as one of your favourites?
If I go back to Egypt, very early on, I was there when we were digging at a site called Smint El Harab. It was a sort of Ptolemaic, late Roman period site. And in some of those houses, there were wooden books, codices, again inscribed with writing, in this case ancient Greek, and again incredibly significant because of the information that those artifacts, like the clay tablets in Syria, those sources, the information those objects provide.
Yeah.
And Gemma, they're good examples because they highlight the importance of the archaeological process, and that process about discovering objects in situ.
Yeah.
That is, we can document very precisely the floor level, the room, the building, the site, the location of those objects. And that context, that in situ context, is what gives the objects their significance. And that significance is defined by that archaeological place that gives meaning and helps us interpret and understand and appreciate those finds.
Yeah. How would you describe the impact of the Syrian civil war on the country's heritage?
We know that in some cases, those sites have been deliberately targeted and destroyed because of the iconic status and significance of those places. Syria has at least 5 sites inscribed on the World Heritage Register. And whilst that listing is of course designed to recognise their importance, and also through that process contribute to the conservation and protection of those sites by identification on that World Heritage List, they've attracted, in this case, unwanted attention. And we know that those groups have deliberately targeted those places because of their notoriety, and it's guaranteed publicity. It's a headline. It's a front page story.
Yeah. How does it feel personally to see footage of the Islamic State destroying ancient sites and artifacts in a matter of seconds?
It's devastating.
Of course, yeah.
It's very difficult to describe. For someone who's worked in the Middle East and in Syria and visited sites such as Palmyra, where we've seen the deliberate destruction of some of those monuments, it's absolutely tragic.
Is there a way for these sites to be restored or better protected in the future?
It's a very good question.
Yeah.
And in the chaos of war, it's hard to prevent the damage and the destruction. I think it's in many ways about raising awareness about the importance of these places, their cultural and historical significance. Often those local communities get overlooked in the archaeological process of excavation. And we as archaeologists have a responsibility to make the information about our finds available to those local communities as a way of including them in the cultural heritage interpretation and management. And I think I'm hoping that, when the situation in Syria stabilises, we can return and resume that research collaboration. And I think we as a community of archaeologists have a role to play in being able to make our discoveries accessible to those local communities so they can feel part of the involvement in that cultural heritage.
Yeah, of course. Just lastly, before we have to let you go, do you have any trips to the region planned or any projects you're currently working on?
Of course, when it's safe to do so,
Yeah,
we
of
would very much be keen to return to contribute and assist with the post-conflict conservation and protection and restoration. And I'm hoping that the Australian archaeologists that were involved in Syria, and we were working there for 3 decades before the conflict started, that we will be able to go back and contribute to that restoration.
Yeah. I wish we weren't, but unfortunately we're running out of time. But thank you so much for coming on and sharing your expertise, and for the work you're doing to discover and protect the regional heritage of the Middle East.
Gemma, thank you very much.
When we get back from the break, we'll share some advice from a couple about the best things to see, do and eat when in Egypt. Welcome back. A lot of the content that we cover throughout the show focuses on regional politics and conflict, but we also want to spend a bit of time exploring some of the beautiful destinations and unique experiences that the Middle East has to offer. So to wrap up tonight's episode, we spoke earlier with Danny and Kaylin, a Canadian couple who spent 10 days discovering Egypt and its unique way of life.
Sorry, the cat's meowing in the background.
Okay, I'm Danny. I'm a graphic designer, and we both live in Mount Uniacke. This is Kaylin.
Hi, I'm a professional photographer, I guess. I don't know what I do. I just take photos of stuff.
The only place that we were was in Egypt last March. I've never been outside of Canada, so I wanted to kind of go somewhere that not many people go. Like, we kept getting people asking us, like, well, why are you going there? It's not safe. And we're like, well, it's not really safe anywhere you go if you look at the news, but, you know. But no, like, we watched all the, like, advisory warnings and stuff, and nothing was really too extreme. So we're just like, you know what, we're going anyway, because if we don't go now, we won't ever go. All of it was so good. And we still didn't even see everything we wanted to see.
You definitely need to sail it, though. You need to sail the Nile, for sure. Yeah, that's a huge one.
Yeah.
I don't know. It was huge for me. Just the fact that you can actually say, yeah, I sailed across the Nile. It's so cool.
It is really cool.
It's so cool. It's a hard one. I don't know. The hot air balloon was my favorite, I think. Yeah, that whole day was great.
Yeah, like that whole, like, what was it, our 4th day or something that we went?
Yeah.
We went first thing in the morning. We got up for sunrise and went on a hot air balloon ride over like all of
the West Bank.
Yeah, all of the West Bank. So you saw like the Valley of the Kings and Queens and the Nile and all this stuff, and ended up like doing a million things that day, and ended up on a felucca ride for the sunset. So we were right from beginning to end. So it was, the whole day was just incredible. So
everything over there just has so much flavor.
Yeah. Well, we had to try is it
koshery?
Koshery. It's like a literally leftover everything. Like, they have like chickpeas and rice and every type of macaroni and like everything.
Throw some sauce in there. I think the biggest thing is mostly taking advantage of the free time that you do have, and like, you don't have to fill your stay with all the big tourist attractions, because going and walking down the streets and seeing the little shops and seeing how people live and how people are going and coming from work and stuff, that's just super cool.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like everyone there is so extremely friendly and so honest, and they're all respectful.
But, you know, like, being there, like, they're so carefree, and they just talk to everybody, and they don't have, not that they don't have a destination, but they kind of like enjoy the journey along that. So it's like totally different than here. And genuinely happy when people come to visit. Like, we got thanked, I don't know how many times when we went to visit. They're like, thank you so much for coming, you know, tell all of your Canadian friends and all this stuff. It was just really, it was very, we can't wait to go back.
Yeah, we want to go back so bad.
we don't have plans yet, but we are going to go back at some point. And we were downtown waiting for our Uber, and like, it's like a 19 million population city. So like, you know, there's a lot of building stuff, and like, when we were waiting, you could still see the pyramids over the buildings, and it was a perfect end to a perfect trip, and you could just everything you do there is going to be incredible. So it really doesn't matter what you do. Like I said, we were there for 10 days. Yeah, and it still wasn't enough. So.
Thank you so much to Danny and Kaylin for sharing their incredible experiences and advice. Visit the website below for more information on travelling in Egypt. That's the end of this week's edition. Share your thoughts on anything we covered on our social media pages and head to our YouTube channel to catch up on highlights from tonight and previous episodes. Tune in next week when we discuss the challenging road ahead for Iraq, Syria and Yemen post-conflict. I'm Gemma Neary. Thanks for watching and have a great night.